some questions, and thank you for that. Malcolm, do we need to people have a microphone? Yeah. So there's roving mics, so please, when you're asking a question, if you could say who you are and if you have an institution affiliation, please say that at the same time, and either to the whole panel or to individuals on the panel.
My name is Lindsay Jones. I'm a research officer here at ODI. We heard from Tim about the need to channel climate finance through developing country governments in order to help them build their capacity. We also heard from Lisa on the issues of challenges of governance and corruption in many of these LDCs, many of which will be most severely impacted by the effects of climate change. So my question is, how do we strike a balance between those two issues, and what instruments do we have available to try and meet those challenges?
Yeah, thank you very much. Very interesting set of presentations. And I have a question for Tom and a question for Lisa.
Sorry, could you just introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Gianni Ruta. I am a PhD student at the Grantham Research Institute, and I am also on sabbatical from the World Bank. So the question for Tom, first of all, congratulations for a very nice presentation in which not just the quality, well, they were not the quality of the answer that struck me, but the quality of the questions you're posing on the table. I think there's a lot of content in that presentation. And the question to Tom is, can we, at least in theory, distinguish between development aid and climate finance? It's a crucial question. And if we can, in theory, then can we go to the next step and do it in practice? I look at one of your tables in which you say adaptation finance is sort of going not where the NAPA's priorities were, but it's going somewhere else. It's not going to food security, it's going to something else. And maybe the reason is that it's easier to finance a government agency that has adaptation on the name than a crop, which you cannot call a crop an adaptation crop as opposed to a development crop, right? So can we then do that next step in practice? And my guess is that information asymmetries may play a big role. So here comes a question for Lisa. And as a good Italian, I know there is corruption, but there are also legal ways to not to pay taxes, for example. And we can find legal ways to avoid paying taxes. So I wonder if the typical developing countries can find legal ways to finance traditional development using adaptation money. So is Transparency International engaged in that type of activity? And again, these two questions I think are very related.
Thank you.
Thanks. My name's Aaron Oxley. I'm with Results UK. My question's for Chris, and that's to ask what he sees, or maybe Difford sees, as the role of insurance as an adaptation mechanism. Particularly, we're particularly interested in crop microinsurance and looking at that as having kind of a double benefit around development and around food security and agriculture and a lot of the other priorities that Difford has. And I'm also really interested in how that overlaps with the role of the private sector in providing that, given the amount of experience they have in managing large-scale reinsurance pools that are of the size that are going to be necessary for large-scale reinsurance of vast chunks of the developing world.
Hi, I'm Laurie Gehring from AlertNet Climate at Thomson Reuters Foundation. I'm curious about this issue of fragile states accessing finance. Does anyone have any examples of where things are working in any of those places? Are there any positive signs, or do we just continue to see funding? I mean, at this point, not so much climate funding, but funding in general going to, in Africa, to the states that are most set up to receive that. Huge amounts of money being spent in those that probably don't need it as much as others, and not much move. I haven't seen any signs of progress. I'm curious if you have on how to solve those problems.
That's a question for you, Marcus.
I think I was going to shift it to Forrest. But okay,
Thank you. My name is Alan Bruder. I'm from Oxfam. Chris, you mentioned that DFID was still working out the practicalities of the how. I would like to hear a little bit more about that, and also in the context of talking a lot about national ownership, what role do you see for civil society? How would civil society interact and play a role? Thank you.
James Hewitt, Independent. I wonder if the panel and indeed listeners might consider whether the discussion is entirely naive. King Canute was not able to stop the tide. Sea level is going to rise, and I don't think we can build barriers all the way around Bangladesh or the Nile Delta. And if most of these adaptation schemes which we've been talking about have such high risks of corruption, poor governments, they're not going to work anyway. So perhaps we really ought to be trying to lobby much more hard with our time, the politicians who ought to be encouraging us to reduce our consumption footprint. At the moment, we seem to be requiring the poor countries to forgive us our consumption.
Okay, let's take those round of questions. Should we just go in the order of presentations, just to give Lisa a chance? So, Tom first. Anyone to respond to that?
Let me respond to the question directly to me as saying, is there, what is the distinction between development finance or aid and climate finance, and how do we do that in practice? I think I would refer you back to the kind of the much shared view of the adaptation continuum that was put out by McGray et al. Back in 2007, I think, which recognises that adaptation actions are diverse through from responding directly to the impact of a climate change or climate change event. On the other hand, at the other side of the continuum, addressing core vulnerability and poverty issues. So in some cases, the actual distinguishing adaptation finance from development finance is impossible. And I don't think we should try to do that in terms of the practicalities of delivering it. Clearly there's a need to do that in terms of where we're sourcing the money. I think where we're running into problems at the moment is that the fact that we need to account for the additional sourcing of the money and delivery of that money is creating challenges at national level about what we can and can't support. And having something that can be considered additional at national level is much easier to report than it is to say, well, actually, we've fully integrated this within a particular stream. And I know from speaking to colleagues in multilateral development banks, they're really struggling to develop methodologies to pick apart the adaptation components of a development loan, for example. And I think the same is going at national level. How we deal with that practically, I think we've got to recognise that there is going to be that there is a considerable overlap between the two, and that we can't get away from the fact that addressing poverty and vulnerability has got to be at the core of that adaptation agenda if we're going to make a difference, and that in doing so we've not got to place the emphasis of the MRV agenda around adaptation constantly on highlighting the additionality or separability of that finance, but recognising that it comes very much from this kind of end user target perspective that Tim mentioned, and I think the perspective that Tim gave about Ministry of Environment leadership for accepting adaptation finance is a dangerous one, actually, and I think we've got good lessons from other sectors about that there needs to be cross-government mechanisms to channel money with leadership from central government departments who are not considered as marginalised often as the Ministry of the Environment. And I think that would lead to if we can get them interested, and I think if we can generate the ownership, I think that would lead to a fairer kind of balance of financing over time, but clearly a very politicised agenda. I don't think I've really answered your question in full, but there's some perspectives.
Yeah. Tim, you want to comment?
Oh, yes.
There were one or two directly to you. You want to comment on the others too?
Well, just a couple of quick thoughts really. I think on the first question, the distinction between or getting the balance right between channeling finance through governments and avoiding some of the risks that we were hearing about, the potential for corruption with lots of new money flowing into potentially weak states. I think what's critical in this debate is that we don't use the perception of corruption as an excuse for inaction. That's important, and that rather we find ways to get around the problem. In the end, I think everybody's agreed that effective states are the best guarantee of delivering the adaptation needs of their poorest communities. So we need to work towards building their capacity. Partly, though, that is going to be about building the capacity of civil society to hold those states to account. And I'm sure Transparency International will show in their report that often it is the presence of those types of communities and the role that they can have which can actually expose corruption. We see that actually with the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis and Malaria, where, let's be clear, there have been examples of corruption, but one of the strengths of that fund is that the involvement of civil society, and it means that when those cases occur, they are actually exposed and can be addressed relatively quickly, and I think that's one of the strengths and a lesson that we should bear in mind. The other question I suppose be interesting to pick up on is the challenge that perhaps we shouldn't worry about adaptation at all, and I'm sure that's deliberately provocative. But no, look, of course, we need to get the balance right, and we shouldn't be simply saying that we should invest all of our energy in adaptation. There's a massive difference between a 2-degree world, a 3-degree world, let alone 5 or 6 degrees. And I think that was a point well made by Tom at the beginning, that everything that we're talking about must continue to go alongside concerted efforts of an entirely new order of magnitude in keeping the pressure on reducing emissions globally. So without prejudice to that, it's also the case that even if we, as we all know, reduce our emissions to zero tomorrow across the world, a certain amount of additional climate change is already locked into the system. And as we're already seeing the impacts on vulnerable countries around the world, it would be entirely irresponsible not to invest concerted efforts in building the adaptive capacity and resilience of those communities. And I think that we do need to be careful in this debate. I think it's very useful, the work of Transparency International and others in drawing attention to the sorts of problems that could arise with corruption, with weak governance, looking at the issue of failed states. We need to have a debate around that, but we shouldn't allow a message to be given more broadly that adaptation is doomed to failure, it can't ever succeed. There are lots and lots of examples, and I'm sure everyone on the panel will have them, and many others in the room as well, of successful adaptation interventions which are having tangible impacts on poor people and saving lives, from shifting to sort of traditional agricultural models in Bolivia to a very new intervention that we've been involved in Bangladesh, which actually works with telecom providers to get early warning systems of incoming typhoons on mobile phones to local fisherfolk. So, I mean, there are all sorts of examples. We all have them, and perhaps we need to do a better job at talking about the positive examples of how a difference is being made, alongside recognising where there are challenges and devising policies to address those challenges.
Yeah, very briefly, Aaron, thank you. On insurance, yes, of course. I mean, it's something that we're very keen to explore. There's examples of work in parts of Africa on crop failure, insurance for crop failure, where I think we've got some useful experience that we can build on. And also a link to the World Bank and some of the work that they're doing on micro-insurance. So I hope we're learning useful lessons from that. It's exploratory, but I think it shows a commitment. Whether that will allow us to work more broadly with the private sector and develop new sorts of interventions, I can't hazard an answer today, but it would be useful to keep in touch on that side of what it is that we know we've got to address. There was a question on civil society as well, and the role for civil society. I mean, again, I suppose it comes back to my comment about nothing earth-shatteringly different in terms of how it is that I would expect our engagement to proceed. Again, I think we've got some very good networks in overseas offices. Again, we value, as I mentioned at the beginning, the interactions that we have in the UK that can help to inform those. And also some really useful lessons, not just from development programming in terms of the health sector, for example, user groups, and the way that those civil society organisations contribute to programming, but also on the forestry side and some of the tribal populations. And again, I think the really detailed work that's been done on forest governance and what that can help to tell us for adaptation. A couple of very quick comments, Laurie, on the fragile states question. I think all I would say is that we've worked very hard over the last 2 or 3 years, perhaps, in terms of mainstream development to focus on fragile states, again, perhaps particularly in Africa. And I think that should give us some confidence that there is a commitment to working out what we need to do in terms of adaptation finance, albeit we're at a very early stage of thinking that through. Like Tim, I suppose I'd draw attention to where we do work in areas to demonstrate impact. Raising homesteads in Bangladesh is an obvious one, but in the aftermath of what's happened in Pakistan, thinking of that as a fragile environment, there are lessons that can be transferred across. And again, Tim's right, there's probably a lot that could be done on comms. And again, on the challenge about mitigation, very briefly, just to say that, of course, we'll be looking at the balance of the way in which the ICF is spent. But I think it's fair to say that it's not simply a developed world, developing world dichotomy. There was new material released today, I think, by DEFRA in relation to UK adaptation. So I think it's something that we recognise as important in this society as well, and that there's a valuable contribution that we can make overseas.
Thank you. Anissa.
Perfect. Thanks. As I said at the beginning, integrity challenges are on both sides of the coin. So it's equally the integrity of developed countries in developing bilateral or multilateral funds in conjunction with developing countries. This issue, the problem, yes, there's problems of corruption. It's would be naive not to recognize that they exist, but understanding that, then how policies are developed, how you take measures to address those challenges should be on the table, and that we need to build the capacities to be able to address those challenges. In particular, from what we do is to try to build capacities, in particular of civil society organizations, so that they can play a part in how national laws or policies are developed to address climate change challenges, and in the hope that these loopholes or legal provisions which are generous that can enable corrupt activity or corrupt behavior are not a part of the policy from the beginning. But also we need to build the capacity of civil society to be able to be involved in how needs assessment, priority planning is being done, to be able to monitor and to hold governments account within their country, and that civil society needs a space that they are able to do that in their country. So this is the kind of activity that we very much support.
Thank you. Malcolm, I wasn't sure with your signaling. We have 1 minute left before we get cut off. Or there was one question from the... Do you have a question? Do you want to pass it on?
Sure. This is a question from Andrew Zubiri, who's in Washington at the moment. He's a junior professional associate at the Global Environment Facility Evaluation Office, and he moderates the Climate Eval Community of Practice program. That program develops and refines existing monitoring and evaluation frameworks and methodologies to measure the effectiveness of climate mitigation and adaptation projects. And in relation to this, his questions are, first of all, what evaluation and monitoring frameworks do you employ to measure the effectiveness of climate adaptation projects? And secondly, what efforts are taken to learn from different organizations and evaluation processes?
That's going to be a question for Chris. Chris, do you want to give a give a short answer and then maybe follow up with an email? Because I expect there's a longer answer that's also available.
Yeah, I mean, it would be good to be in touch with colleagues from the GEF. I know that colleagues in another of our teams in Climate and Environment Department lead on the GEF. There's a broader question, of course, about the monitoring and evaluation frameworks, and I think it's fair to say at the moment it's work in progress under the ICF. All of our funding for climate issues, mitigation, adaptation and forestry will come under the ICF. So that's work in progress, I think is the best that I can give today. And I suppose it sounds trite, but yes, of course, we would want to learn from experience in other organisations. So again, the link to the GEF is an important one that we already have, but Erin's question on the private sector aspects and the work that you're doing, it would be useful to learn from that as well.
Yeah. Okay, well look, thank you very much indeed, and thank you panel for joining. I think there were three things that struck me about today. First of all was there's quite a shared perception of the questions that are out there, and I think everyone's talking about how to ensure vulnerable get participate in the process, how do you ensure decent national ownership, how do you ensure you're getting the value for money out of the investments that you're doing. But I also think there's some tensions and there's some unresolved issues, which I think you've heard some of that today from sort of Oxfam position that it should be really budget support, and that allows the government then really to decide what they want to spend the money on, and maybe it doesn't even necessarily have to be on adaptation. Through to actually what we need to do is, there's some clear areas that should be prioritised, and these are agriculture, water and food security. And I think the question about how much we know technically about what the priorities should be, and also what is right politically to be demanding, I think is a conversation we'll run on. I am very struck by how much of this debate echoes debates around aid, but also actually more and more about the issues around debt relief. I think some of the answers that came out of the debt relief debate are actually also answers are here. And finally, it's also good to end with